The nighttime rite that haunted Roman brides for centuries. The screaming always began at midnight. In the shadowed atrium of the Villa Cornelia, 17-year-old Lucia Maxima stood trembling in her saffron wedding veil, the flammeum, its flame-colored fabric clinging to her pale shoulders like a shroud. Outside, Rome slept beneath a moonless sky, but inside this house, the ancient rite was about to begin. The one her mother had whispered about in warnings, the one her grandmother had survived, but never discussed, the one that had driven her Aunt Claudia to madness 3 decades prior. Around her, the matrons formed a circle. Their faces were masks of solemnity in the flickering lamplight, their eyes reflecting something between pity and duty. The air was thick with the smoke of myrrh and something metallic and wrong. In the corner, an old woman prepared the lectus genialis, the marriage bed, spreading across it herbs that Lucia did not recognize, muttering prayers in a Latin so ancient it predated the Republic itself. This was the domum deductio, the bringing home. But what came next was never written in the marriage contracts, never discussed in the forum, never acknowledged by the Senate. It was the secret that bound every Roman matron together, the nightmare that waited beyond the threshold of respectability, the price that women paid for the privilege of becoming wives. And tonight, Lucia would learn why some brides never smiled again. If you're captivated by the dark corners of history that textbooks dare not touch, consider following this channel. The past is full of secrets, and we're here to unearth every last one. Rome, 113 CE, the reign of Trajan. The empire stretched from the misted forests of Britannia to the sun-scorched deserts of Mesopotamia, and dominion so vast that the Mediterranean had become merely a Roman lake. Mare Nostrum. In the streets, monuments rose in gleaming marble, celebrating conquest and glory. But in the private chambers of patrician homes, behind doors sealed with wax and guarded by ancestral spirits, Rome practiced rituals that would have horrified even the barbarians it conquered. The wedding had been magnificent. Lucia remembered it in fragments now, like shards of a broken mirror, each piece reflecting a moment of splendor that had felt like a beautiful lie. The ceremony at the temple of Juno Pronuba, where the auspices had been read in the flight of birds. The clasping of hands, dextrarum junctio, with Marcus Decimus, a man 20 years her senior whom she'd met precisely twice before their betrothal. The sacrifice of a pig, its squeals cutting through the morning air, blood dark against white stone. Her father, Senator Lucius Maximus, had beamed with pride. This marriage elevated their family, connected them to one of Rome's oldest bloodlines. Marcus Decimus was wealthy, politically connected, a veteran of the Dacian campaigns who bore the scars of empire on his weathered face. He had smiled at her with teeth like tombstones. She had worn the traditional attire, the white tunica recta, woven in the ancient way on an upright loom. The 6 pads of artificial hair arranged in the semi-crines, the archaic hairstyle bound with woolen ribbons, the flammeum, that saffron veil that marked her as a bride and concealed her face from the evil eye. Around her waist, the cingulum, the knot that her husband would later untie, a knot tied with a special configuration known as the Herculean knot, which no one would explain to her. The feast had lasted hours. Honeyed wine flowed like rivers, roasted peacock and dormice stuffed with nuts. Poets had recited epithalamia, wedding songs, some so obscene that the older matrons had covered their mouths and laughed behind their hands. As the sun descended and Rome's 7 hills cast long shadows across the city, Lucia had felt the first stirrings of genuine fear. Her mother, Fabia, had approached her in the late afternoon, pulling her aside into a private chamber. Fabia's face had been drawn, her eyes haunted by memories she refused to articulate. "Night," her mother had said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You must be brave. What happens? It is necessary. It has always been necessary." Since the days of Romulus, since the rape of the Sabine women, since the founding of this city on blood and abduction. Rome was built on the bodies of women, Lucia. We are the foundation stones upon which the Forum stands. Mother, you're frightening me. Fabia had gripped her daughter's shoulders with surprising strength. Good. Fear will prepare you. Trust the matrons, obey the Rite, and remember, you are not the first and you will not be the last. We have all survived this. Most of us. She had paused, and something dark had flickered across her face. Most of us. Now, as midnight approached, Lucia understood that her mother's words had been both warning and prophecy. The procession through Rome's streets had been the last moment of public celebration, and it had felt like a funeral march. Musicians led the way, playing flutes, the Tibicines, their melodies haunting in the falling darkness. Behind them came the torchbearers, 5 boys carrying spinny albae, hawthorn torches that crackled and sparked, their light painting the ancient buildings in shades of amber and blood. The smell of burning wood and pitch filled the air. Lucia had walked surrounded by women. Her paranymphi, the bridesmaids, supported her on either side, their grips firm, as though preventing her escape. Behind them, the crowd of wedding guests sang the traditional Fescennine verses, songs so sexually explicit they would make a legionary blush. The Romans believed such vulgarity warded off evil spirits. But Lucia had seen no evil spirits in the crowd. Only the faces of other women, mothers, sisters, daughters, watching with expressions she now recognized as shared trauma. They knew. Every married woman lining those streets knew what awaited her beyond the threshold of the Villa Cornelia. And they watched in silence, complicit in their own histories. When they reached the house, Marcus Decimus had been waiting at the entrance, dressed in his finest toga. The moment of ritual significance. The bride had to be carried across the threshold. Never willingly must she enter her new home. This was the tradition, rooted in Rome's most shameful legend. Romulus and his men, desperate for wives, had stolen the Sabine women, carrying them across thresholds by force. Every Roman wedding reenacted this primordial abduction. Marcus had lifted her, his hands cold even through her layers of fabric, and carried her into the darkness of the house. The guests had cheered. Lucia had felt like she was drowning. Inside, the impluvium caught what little moonlight penetrated the autumn clouds, its reflecting pool a black mirror. The household gods, the Lares and Penates, watched from their niches, silent and judgmental. Oil lamps cast shadows that seemed to writhe along the frescoed walls, images of mythological scenes, Zeus transforming into a swan to assault Leda, Pluto dragging Proserpina into the underworld, Tereus pursuing Philomela through the forest. Every image depicted violation. Every story in Roman mythology was a lesson in female suffering. Marcus had set her down gently, and for a moment, she'd allowed herself to hope that perhaps her mother had exaggerated, that perhaps this marriage would be ordinary, that perhaps... Then the matrons had arrived. They had entered like priestesses at a mystery cult, silent and solemn. 8 women, all married, all initiated into this secret rite. Lucia recognized some. Her mother Fabia, her aunt Tertia, her husband's sister Cornelia. Others were strangers, older matrons whose names she did not know but whose presence carried weight. The eldest was Domitia, a woman in her 70s with silver hair and eyes like chips of flint. She was the pronuba, the guide, the one who would oversee the ritual. In her hands, she carried a bundle wrapped in crimson cloth. Lucia found she could not look away from it. "The men will leave us now," Domitia announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to obedience. Marcus had nodded, kissing his new bride on the forehead, a gesture that felt more like a brand than affection, and departed with the male guests. Their laughter faded down the corridor, receding like hope itself. The door had been sealed. Lucia stood alone with the matrons, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The lamps flickered, as though touched by a wind that came from nowhere. "Child," Domitia said, stepping forward. You are now at the threshold between girlhood and womanhood, between your father's house and your husband's, between the living and the dead. Do you know why we are here? Lucia's voice was a whisper. No. To perform the noctis officium, the duty of the night, the rite that has been passed from mother to daughter, from matron to bride, since Rhea Silvia was violated by Mars himself and gave birth to the founders of Rome. We are the keepers of the old ways, the practitioners of the sacred violation, the guardians of the threshold. The words made no sense. Sacred violation? Guardians of what threshold? Domitia unwrapped the crimson bundle. Inside lay objects that made Lucia's blood turn to ice. A bronze knife with a handle carved in the shape of a phallus, a shallow bowl of aged black pottery, a collection of herbs that smelled of earth and decay, and, most horrifying, a small figurine carved from bone depicting a woman in a position of submission. Long ago, Domitia continued, her voice taking on the rhythmic quality of a priest reciting liturgy. Before Rome, before the Republic, before even the kings, there was the understanding. Men take by force, women yield by necessity. This is the cosmic order. Mars, god of war, is the father of Rome. His conquest of the Vestal Virgin Rhea Silvia was not sacrilege. It was founding myth. Rape is not crime in our tradition. It is Genesis. Lucia felt bile rising in her throat. What are you saying? That tonight you will undergo the imitatio violationis, the imitation of violation. You will be symbolically broken, as all Roman women must be broken, so that you understand your place, so that you know in your bones and blood that your body does not belong to you. It belongs to your husband, to Rome, to the empire. This is madness, Lucia breathed. Her mother stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. It is tradition, and we are all bound by it. They led her to the lectus genialis, the marriage bed that had been prepared with such terrible care. The mattress was stuffed with wool and herbs. She could smell wormwood and rue, plants associated with protection and purification, but also with death. The coverlet was embroidered with scenes from the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, a marriage that began the chain of events leading to the Trojan War. Even the bedding spoke of tragedy. The matrons formed a circle around her. Domitia began to chant in that ancient Latin, words that predated classical forms, syllables that seemed to crawl rather than flow. Per vim venit vita, per dolorem venit sapientia, per sanguinem venit imperium. Through force comes life, through pain comes wisdom, through blood comes empire. They began to undress her with ritualistic precision. Each layer removed was accompanied by prayers, or were they curses, the tunica recta, the undergarments, the jewelry, till she stood naked in the lamplight, her skin prickling with cold and terror. Cornelia, her new sister-in-law, stepped forward with the bowl and the bronze knife. Your blood, she said flatly, must sanctify the marriage bed, not the blood of virginity, that is for your husband's taking. This is different, this is older. She made a small cut on Lucia's palm, swift, professional, and caught the blood in the black pottery bowl. The pain was sharp, immediate, grounding. Lucia watched her blood pool in the ancient vessel, and understood suddenly that countless women's blood had stained this same bowl. How many brides had bled here? How many had stood where she stood, trembling and terrified? Domitia took the bowl and began to paint symbols on Lucia's skin. On her forehead, a downward pointing triangle. On her sternum, a spiral. On her abdomen, marks that looked like ancient letters or perhaps wounds themselves. These are the sigils of submission, the old woman intoned. They mark you as property, as vessel, as sacrifice. When your husband takes you tonight, these marks will transfer to him symbolically, binding you in a contract older than law, deeper than love. They laid her on the bed. The bone figurine was placed on her chest, cold and obscene. The herbs were burned in a censer, filling the room with acrid smoke that made her eyes water and her head swim. Then came the worst part. Chapter 5. The Breaking. The matrons began to speak, each one in turn, sharing their own stories. And Lucia realized this was not just a ritual. It was a trauma passed like an inheritance, generation to generation. Cornelia spoke first, her voice hollow. I was 15. My husband was 50. On our wedding night, the matrons performed this rite, and when they left, he did not wait. He did not care that I wept. He said it was his right, his ius, and it was. Roman law made my body his property. Tertia, Lucia's aunt, spoke next. I tried to run. Before my wedding, I tried to flee to the temple of Vesta, to become a priestess, to escape. They dragged me back. My father beat me. The rite was performed. I learned that there is no escape for women in Rome. We are born into captivity. One by one, they confessed their nights of horror, forced marriages, violent husbands, pregnancies that nearly killed them, miscarriages, children they were forced to bear for men they despised. The litany of suffering was endless, a chorus of female pain echoing through centuries, and Lucia understood. The Noctis Officium was not about the wedding night itself. It was about breaking the spirit before the body could be broken. It was about ensuring that when her husband violated her, and he would, because that was what Roman marriage meant, she would already be hollow, already resigned, already dead inside. This was how Rome perpetuated itself. Not just through military conquest, but through the systematic destruction of half its population. Women were not citizens. They were resources. Wombs to produce soldiers. Bodies to satisfy men. Property to be transferred from father to husband without ever possessing autonomy. Her mother knelt beside the bed, gripping Lucia's hand, the one that bled. I'm sorry, Fabia whispered. I'm so sorry. But this is what it means to be Roman. This is the price of empire. Our suffering is the foundation upon which the Forum stands. Our silence is what allows the Senate to debate philosophy and law. While they speak of virtues and gravitas, we bear the weight of their civilization in our bodies. Domitia leaned close, her breath smelling of wine and age. Night, when your husband comes to you, you will submit. You will not fight. You will not protest, because you are no longer Lucia Maxima, daughter of Lucius. You are Lucia Decima, wife of Marcus, property of his household, bound to his manus, his hand, his power, his absolute authority over you. Do you understand? Lucia found she could not speak. She could only nod. The old woman smiled, a terrible knowing smile. Good. Then the rite is complete. They dressed her in a thin sleeping gown, gossamer fabric that concealed nothing. They removed the blood symbols with oil and rough cloth, scrubbing until her skin was raw. They arranged her hair to appear disheveled, as though she'd already been taken. They positioned her on the bed in a pose of submission. Then, one by one, the matrons departed. Her mother was the last to leave, pausing at the threshold, her face a mask of grief. Survive, Fabia said. That is all we can do. Survive. The door closed. Lucia was alone, and in the distance, she heard footsteps approaching. But Marcus Decimus did not come. Lucia lay in the marriage bed, her heart hammering, waiting for the footsteps to reach her chamber. But they passed by. Faded down another corridor. She heard a door open and close. Far away. Silence. She waited 1 hour, then 2. The oil lamps burned low, their light dimming to embers. Outside, a storm broke over Rome. Late autumn rain lashing the tiles of the roof, thunder rolling across the hills like the drums of approaching legions. Finally, unable to bear the suspense, Lucia rose from the bed. Her wounded hand throbbed. The herbs and blood and ritual had left her feeling poisoned, feverish. She wrapped herself in a cloak and, against all protocol, left the bridal chamber. The villa was dark, labyrinthine. She moved through it like a ghost, past silent slaves who averted their eyes, past the household shrines where ancestors watched in eternal judgment. She followed instinct, or perhaps something deeper, a thread of female intuition that pulled her toward the truth. She found Marcus in his private study, a room she had never been permitted to enter. He sat at a desk, still in his wedding finery, but his face was buried in his hands, and he was weeping. Lucia stood in the doorway, stunned. This powerful man, this veteran of empire's wars, this master of her fate, sobbing like a child. "Marcus?" she whispered. He looked up, startled, his face wet with tears and something like shame. For a long moment they stared at each other, two prisoners in the same cell, trapped by different bars. "You should not be here," he said, his voice hoarse. "You should be—" She couldn't finish the sentence. He laughed bitterly. "Claiming my rights? Taking my property? Yes, that is what Rome expects. That is what I am supposed to do." He stood, moving to a small shrine in the corner. Not the household gods, but something older. A clay figurine of indeterminate gender, worn smooth by countless touches. "Do you know what I learned in Dacia?" Marcus asked, his back to her. "I learned that civilization is a lie we tell ourselves to justify horrors. I saw men, good Roman men, senators' sons, do things to the barbarian women that would make Tartarus itself recoil. And they called it conquest. They called it duty." He turned to face her, and she saw in his eyes the same haunted look she'd seen in her mother's face. "I will not touch you, Lucia," he said quietly. "Not tonight. Not unless you wish it. I brought you here to be my wife in name, to satisfy the social contract, to maintain appearances, but I will not become the monster that Rome demands I be." Lucia felt the world tilting. The matrons, the Rite, they said, "I know what they said. I know what they did. My mother was a matron once. She performed that ritual on countless brides before her death. And she died hating herself for it, hating Rome, hating all of us for perpetuating this cycle of sanctified violence. Then why marry at all?" "Because," Marcus said, his voice cracking, "to refuse marriage is to mark oneself as impious, antisocial, un-Roman. I would lose my position, my wealth, my voice in the Senate. I would become nothing, so I compromised. I married you. But I will not compound that compromise with rape." Lucia moved further into the room, drawn by the sheer strangeness of this confession. "What happens now?" "We perform," Marcus said simply. "We pretend. Tomorrow morning, I will present to the household the tokens of your virginity, which I have already prepared with sheep's blood. Your mother and the matrons will inspect them and declare the marriage consummated. You will be officially a matron yourself, and life will continue." "And in private?" He met her eyes. "In private, we will be what we choose to be. Perhaps friends, perhaps allies, perhaps nothing at all. But not master and slave, not rapist and victim. I have seen enough of that to last several lifetimes." Lucia stood in that study, in the house that was now supposed to be her prison, and felt something unexpected, the faintest stirring of hope. But it was not relief, because she understood now what the noctis officium truly was. It was not about physical violation. That was merely the expected outcome. It was about psychological destruction. It was about teaching women that they had no agency, no voice, no value beyond their utility to men. And even with a husband who refused to harm her, she would still carry the scars of that ritual. She would still wake at night remembering the matrons' faces, their stories, the bone figurine on her chest. Rome had already broken her. Marcus's mercy did not undo that breaking. Chapter 7. The morning after dawn came gray and cold. The storm had passed, leaving Rome washed clean but somber, as though the city itself was in mourning. Lucia returned to the bridal chamber before the household awoke. She and Marcus had staged the scene carefully. Rumpled linens, the prepared bloodstains, her hair disheveled in the right way, her eyes red from crying, which required no performance. When Fabia and the matrons arrived to inspect, Lucia watched her mother's face. Fabia examined the evidence, nodded approvingly, embraced her daughter with what might have been genuine relief. "It is done," Fabia announced to the others. "She is a wife now. She has crossed the threshold." But Lucia saw the weight in her mother's eyes. She understood that Fabia had survived her own version of this night, and whether it had been like Lucia's or worse, it had left marks that never healed. The matrons departed. The household resumed its routines. Slaves brought breakfast. The day began as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. But everything had changed. Lucia lived in that marriage for 3 decades. She and Marcus maintained their arrangement, a marriage of companionship rather than domination, of mutual respect rather than ownership. They had no children, which raised eyebrows, but was never scandalous enough to cause real scandal. She became a matron herself, respected in social circles, a model of Roman virtue. And when her own daughter, adopted to maintain appearances, reached marriageable age, Lucia found herself facing the impossible choice. She could refuse to participate in the noctis officium. She could break the chain. But to do so would mark her family as impious, would destroy her daughter's prospects, would unravel the careful pretense that had protected them both for so many years. Or she could join the circle of matrons, perpetuate the cycle, become what she had once feared. In the end, she chose the latter. Because that is what Rome demanded. That is what empire required. She performed the rite. She spoke the ancient words. She watched another young woman's spirit break beneath the weight of tradition. And she understood, finally, what her mother had meant all those years ago. They had all survived. But survival is not the same as living. The noctis officium was never written down in official histories. No law codified it. No philosopher debated its ethics in the forum, but it persisted for centuries, passed mother to daughter, matron to bride, a secret ceremony of trauma bonding and systemic subjugation. Modern historians debate the specifics of Roman marriage customs, piecing together fragments from letters and literature. They speak clinically of manus marriage versus sine manu, of property transfer and legal authority. But beneath the legal terminology lies a darker truth that few wish to acknowledge. Rome's greatness was built on the backs of half its population. While the Senate debated law and the legions conquered frontiers, women endured a domestic tyranny so normalized it became invisible. Their suffering was not a bug in the system. It was the system itself. Every bride who crossed that threshold, every matron who performed the rite, every woman who smiled at banquets while carrying the weight of sanctified violation. They were the true foundation of empire. And their silence was the price of civilization. The screaming always began at midnight, but by dawn it had transformed into something worse: acceptance, resignation, the quiet death of the self in service to the state, and Rome called this virtue